Once again, we dip into new wave post-punk history for AppSec inspiration, this time with SoftCell's Tainted Love, which they released in July 1981 with the line, "Once I ran to you, now I run from you," which could be a theme for thread safety, input validation, CISO roles, or really anything summed up by the lyric, "For I toss and turn, I can't sleep at night." Which means this week we chat with Larry Maccherone from Contrast Security about zero-day vulns and why the conversation around them should focus less on the zero and more on the vuln. Then in the news segment, a return of speculative attacks, CSRB's first report, engineering for a SOC 2 report, a Mac malware book report, and more. Start running and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
This is episode 204, recorded July 18th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella and Joe South, who will be joining us in a moment. But hello, John.
I'm here to bring you some nonstop application security news and interviews.
Excellent reference. Thank you, John. Quick announcement, don't miss any of our favorite or your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. Looking at Larry Maccherone's career, you might think he can't figure out what he wants to be when he grows up. Serial entrepreneur, agile transformation coach, one day I'll speak, open source developer, data scientist, DevSecOps thought leader. However, the underlying theme is that Larry has constantly been striving to create the highest performing software engineering teams. At Comcast, Larry built and scaled the DevOps transformation program over 5 years, and he's now looking to apply what he learned doing that to help all Contrast customers and prospects. Hello, Larry. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Mike and John, glad to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Well, happy to have you here because we had you before because I recall reading off that fun bio of yours, and you jump around a lot, but always giving us some good insights and some good anecdotes from your experience, which the last time your experience was DevSecOps, transforming it. But now I think we want to talk about something a little bit different, which is 0 days. And I think we can skip over the idea of what 0 days are and perhaps why we should be worried about them. But part of kind of your pitch, part of the idea is 0-day vulns and what's next. And I don't think we're trying to predict what the next 0-day vulnerability should be, but what can we do better to respond to 0-day vulnerabilities? So set this up a little bit for us. How do we avoid getting into the next mad scramble when it's going to be Java or something else that's the new 0-day everybody's talking about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects to it. I'm not going to spit them all out with that one prompt. But the first thing you sort of have to not just conceptually recognize, but actually change your planning and the way you think about the problem around this one idea. There is going to be another big one. And it's not going to be a long time before that happens. Mm-hmm. Expect the next big one. So one of the interesting things that happened with the Log4Shell attack that happened in December was that within a few days after the original CVSS 10 that was discovered and a patch was released for, there was a 7.8, I think, was the not in the 9s or 10s, but a one that would be considered sort of a high severity level CVSS score 7 and above is sort of what most people, I think, would call high severity, was discovered in the same part of the code base. And it had been in there just as long as the original vulnerability that was the 10, but it hadn't been found. And the only reason it was found within a few days after this is that part of the code got a lot of extra scrutiny. So what that tells me is that the open source libraries that we depend upon, that we rely upon for all of our applications, are riddled with these things. And it's just a matter of time until a bad guy finds one and starts attacking them. And so we have to sort of change our mindset to be, well, this is a one-time thing. Let's just respond and react. And then maybe if it happens again, we'll respond and react again. No, you have to get into the point where you're really ready for the next one. And that's really where the rest of the conversation, I think, today should really focus around.
Yeah, and I think it's the idea of respond and react, and even with Log4j, great example, because everybody was scrambling. But I think part of that too is we can't just start with the response of, well, everyone should be doing software composition analysis, because part of the problem was that Log4j showed up in tons of places, especially a lot of third-party devices, third-party logging infrastructure that weren't part of that CI/CD pipeline where a lot of people are applying SCA. Now, I'm not saying this to say SCA is a failure, it's bad, et cetera, but pointing out this was a broader issue, and the idea that there needs to be a response of some kind. And I think unpacking that response is a little bit more of what does a good response look like? Or what if we're trying to say there is another one coming, be prepared. How, what recommendations do you have for organizations to start breaking down that idea of what they should be preparing for?
Well, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, so I have a lot of broad expertise, but I'm going to break this problem down into sort of 3 categories, and I don't have deep expertise in one of those 3. And so that's the one I'm going to mention first, is that for applications that are provided by a third party that were built in Java, you would have to have a sort of a regular vendor management incident response cycle, and that's the part that I'm not really deep in. So I think that is important and critical, and you should have that and make sure you do that. One thing I can also say about that one category, though, is that the solution that the government has sort of settled on as the best way to sort of help people with that is this idea of sharing SBOMs when you have new releases of software. And while I think that might help, I really think a better way would be for people to protect themselves and use binary software composition analysis. In the case of Java, we actually provide the ability to do that, but there are products out there that specialize in binary SCA, and check them for yourself. There's some folks who worry that that's a violation of your license agreement, but I would say if that's a violation of your license agreement, then you better go get that license agreement changed. And even if it's sort of in the gray area, I would say do it anyway, because you're just protecting yourself. And I can't imagine there's a huge liability, even if it's technically against the license agreement, if the vendor themselves was the one who still has the vulnerability in that. So that's the one big category is sort of third-party provided things. And the other 2 categories I am sort of an expert in. And the second one of those is applications that aren't modern DevOps, actively developed, that don't have an automated functional test suite and don't have developers sort of working on them every day, maybe. Those applications you really need to protect in production. And for that, we at Contrast Security, where I work now, we have a product, a runtime application self-protection product, which is essentially a replacement, an upgrade for WAF, Web Application Firewall. And I would say you could rip out your WAFs and just use our RASP. Our RASP pre-protected every application that was running on against the Log4Shell attack in December, and then the Spring4Shell attacks that occurred in, I think, March. A little less severe because there was not as many people using Spring as there were using Log4j, but still pretty severe. And anyone who had our RASP product running would have been protected. Whereas a WAF product, you have to wait until the WAF vendor comes out with new signatures. And even then, they tell you to test so that the new signatures don't break, legitimate use of your application. And so for less developed apps, apps that are maybe a little older, don't have an automated functional test suite, that's the category 2. I'd say go RASP. And of course, I work for a company that happens to have a RASP product, but I would have said this whether I worked there or not. And then the third category, which is probably the area I'm the most expert in, and I'm just going to mention it and then hand the sort of control back to you, Mike, is applications that are actively developed. And for that, I have a whole set of things that I think you should be doing.
Yeah, and we'll come back to sort of that the WAF RASP aspect and the legacy. But even part of that discussion, you mentioned, it probably doesn't have a lot of functional testing. And what you just said right there at the end about the category of apps that are under active development, those likely will or should at least in principle have a lot of functional testing. And this is where we can at least target that one third or of the categories first, because those are getting into good engineering behaviors. So tell us a little bit more about why functional testing or testing can be a useful practice, a useful defense when we're talking about that premise of dealing with 0 days.
Yeah, so I mean, most people immediately thought of software composition analysis tools, SBOM tools, open source security tools. That's all different names for the same thing. When Log4Shell and Spring4Shell were happening, and those are important because they will tell you what applications have this particular vulnerable version of the library. But in order to effectively use those, you have to be able to upgrade to the latest version of that dependency. Now, in the case of Log4j, there was a way to actually turn off the functionality that enabled the injection and not break most people's use of the log. And if it did break people's use of the log, it basically meant that the log had a little less human readable information in it. So it wasn't a really bad breaking, and it was not customer facing breaking. It was your logs. And so that doesn't necessarily apply so much, but in most cases, when you have a 0 day, you have to upgrade to the latest version of that dependency. And if you're 3 dependencies back, even if they're sort of in the third segment of a SEMVer, 9.11.42, even if it's .42 to .49, it's not supposed to be backward breaking, but you still have to have confidence that it isn't backward breaking to upgrade from 42 to 49. And that's where the functional test suite comes in. You really do need to have an automated functional test suite that gives you confidence that you can upgrade to 49 without a problem. The other thing that having that automated functional test suite will do is it'll give your development team confidence and actually some efficiencies to stay close to the latest. So whenever they fall more than the second digit behind, you could be a policy that we have to put that on our backlog to upgrade to that. And if you have an automated functional test suite, that could be a few clicks and you've upgraded to that because you know that the upgrade in the second digit didn't break your app, and we can go on. So you think of automated functional test suite as a quality thing only, but it really has a very deep, important security aspect to it there.
Yeah, and I like that the introduction of that aspect of quality and just being, call it aggressive about staying up to date on your SEMVer minor versions, for example, even regardless of the security dimension to them, because it builds that practice, builds that capabilities. One of the things, though, and maybe I'm not sure how much we should go deep here, but testing is important. Testing, as you said, gives you confidence that, yes, this point update still works, your app still works as expected, as desired, go forth, release, etc. But tests aren't, you also have confidence that you have good test coverage, for example. And a lot of times this might be unit testing versus functional testing. So what are some good ways you've seen about engineers or even AppSec teams describe what that good functional type of testing could be, or ways to implement it effectively so that you can have confidence also in that test coverage, the quality of the testing, if you will, on top of the quality of the software?
So the world has changed dramatically in just the last few years in terms of the recommendations there. And not everyone, even up-to-date software developers, have sort of absorbed this, because the people who have made the updates are sort of not necessarily very loud about it, because they're admitting they were wrong a while back. And that thing that they were wrong about is the emphasis on unit testing. Now, in a world where you had a lot of monolithic application development, and you weren't using a lot of external services, then isolating that part of the code by mocking the things it depends on was feasible. And so the recommendation, the squeeze, the juice was worth the squeeze, right? So the squeeze was not very difficult. Nowadays, with software as a service, database as a service, storage as a service, message bus as a service, everything as a service, identity as a service, sometimes even access control frameworks. You're depending on a lot more things that are stood up in separate processes, and it's first of all very expensive to mock those. And so the recommendation that you have isolated unit tests where you mock any external dependency, that's pretty old. And I think that's sort of out of style now. The only thing I recommend you use unit tests for, that isolated concept of unit tests for, anymore, is for sort of tricky business logic that you can easily sort of test in isolation, algorithms, things like that, that you can test in isolation. Everything else, I recommend you sort of shift your focus towards more end-to-end API level functional kind of testing.
It's funny. I'm agreeing with your general premise of it's even for me as a small startup, we've got enough moving parts that it becomes difficult to do those unit tests unless you're mocking stuff like crazy. I almost wonder if there's another sort of paradigm in there of being able to build the tests into the code, almost like feature flags, that as the code runs, you're able to turn in test mode and it helps test itself. I'm just, this is not a well thought out idea. It just sort of popped in my head. But I'm a fan of something which you can do in an automated fashion besides just doing the QA style test. So I'm just sort of grasping for straws there.
Well, so here's another paradigm shift that I think might make you feel more comfortable, John. Most folks think that the sort of big automated functional testing only occurs sort of later in the development cycle after the product has been shipped to QA or a staging environment. And that's probably true for, the majority of folks today at this point. But the newer trend, and what I recommend, in fact, this is one of the first things I usually coach people on, and it takes a little bit of convincing sometimes, but I usually get everyone over the hump, every engineering lead over the hump on this, is that you have to sort of move that testing into the pipeline before the feature branch to development branch merge decision. And so you go, oh my gosh, these things take hours to run. They depend on a bunch of things. There's a sandbox database. How am I going to move all that into an ephemeral, container-oriented, stand it up 100 times a day kind of environment? Well, there's engineering work there. It's not trivial engineering work either. That sandbox database with a known starting state is usually the biggest lift for doing what I'm saying. But the tools have gotten a lot better for enabling this. The ability to parallelize a test suite is almost trivial now. I've gotten used to doing this with Cypress.io, and I can take a test suite that normally runs in an hour, and in a few minutes I can parallelize it so it finishes in 5 minutes. Now it means I have to spin up a dozen or more CI containers in my CI environment, but that's trivial also nowadays with modern CI. So there is some help with moving that into the pre pull request merge cycle, and that merge cycle is tighter. It's maybe code you wrote this morning gets merged this afternoon, and so it's not like you're talking about days before it runs through that cycle. You can usually execute it multiple times a day as the developer who wrote the code, and then you don't expose it to the rest of your team for a peer review until after it passes everything automatically.
Cool. For those of our listeners playing along at home. Yeah, no, that does help. For our listeners playing along at home, that's Cypress, C-Y-P-R-E-S-S, not C-Y-P-R-Y-S, which I went to the wrong one, R-U-S. No, it does. And that's... there's always, right, engineering, and that's sort of part of the challenge for any company, not a load a small one, is like, Mike and I are always talking about, like, he wants to refactor everything. And I'm like, no, my team has stuff to do that actually gets money. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of part of that again, is like how, this is not the question, this is rhetorical, but like finding the time to do that. I don't want to say refactoring, but sort of putting that engineering test mentality and execution into place is a bit of a holy grail, but it's a good thing to work for.
Yeah, I don't think of it as a holy grail, actually. I mean, that's unachievable, right? Nobody ever really found the holy grail. So it's definitely not a holy grail. It's definitely achievable, and it's being achieved more and more. When I did this at Comcast, I a lot of folks are sort of like, wow, Larry, that's a big leap from where we are now. That's a lot of work. But over the course of the 5 years that I was there, I got to the point where about 25% of all development was done on that kind of environment. And we made a wholesale effort as an organization to make that easier. We were on a path to get to 100% when I left. Within a year and a half after I left, I mean, we had rapidly accelerated that path. It took work to sort of create the right templates and get that to be the norm. Another thing that's helping is this. I don't know if you're familiar, John, if you've done any development in Jamstacks. Pretty much every Jamstack out of the box, whether it's a open source thing or whether it's a vendor provided thing, that pretty much every Jamstack actually already has this baked into the examples, how to do this. And so it's sort of baked in when you start developing in a Jamstack. I know not everyone's in a Jamstack yet, but that's the next new stack that's coming out.
Interesting. I've heard of them, but haven't used them. And yeah, it's thanks for calling me on that. It's definitely not a holy grail. That's a bad choice of words on my part, but yeah, that gives us something more to look into with Jamstacks. Neat.
Yeah, I think what I liked about this direction too is that you anticipated one of my questions and already answered it in the sense of what's the time overhead of just waiting for these tests to finish. And you described containerization helps this, parallelization. So rather than waiting for an hour, you're waiting for maybe 5 minutes, because that how long do I have to wait is the exact same complaint comment for an SCA tool for that matter, or an explicit security tool that's added to the CI/CD pipeline, which right now we've actually been very engineering focused about why functional testing actually has some very implicit security benefits here. I am going to belabor the point just a little bit more, because I like the fact, Larry, that you're talking about getting that, that 5-year mission. I don't think you're the only one to go on a 5-year mission to explore strange new CI/CD pipelines, for example. But how did you get buy-in for, honestly, engineers to do more work, meaning write these functional tests, have more functional test coverage?
Well, let me put that on a pin in that for a second. How did I get buy-in to get developers to write more functional tests? I do want to come back to this sort of parallelization thing that you mentioned, though. It's nobody has parallelized a SAST tool. You can't parallelize a SAST tool very easily. It's possible, I guess, in theory, to do it. But the big part of building a SAST tool is building the data flow graph, the data flow model. And, I can see the queries being parallelized that run against that data flow model, but that's actually a small portion of what what takes the time of a SaaS tool running. On the other hand, an IaaS tool, if you parallelize your test runs automatically and you have IaaS running on every instance of that test run, which is maybe only running 1/12 of the total test suite in my example earlier, then IaaS will finish basically in the same time that the automated test suite. So IaaS naturally parallelizes. So that's why I'm a huge fan of IaaS. One of the several reasons, the other being low false positives, a bigger reason being low false positives. But that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of IaaS. Back to the pin, how do you get buy-in for getting developers to do this? It's very hard to get it in mass. So I don't even try to get it in mass. I don't try to get that buy-in in mass. I get it one team at a time. And the way I do it is I basically offer a service to that team saying, hey, in 2 hours, a 2-hour pairing session, one of my staff will pair with one of your engineers. And at the end of that 2-hour session, we will have accomplished 3 things for you. We will have a hello world test running for you that will be post login. So hello world, but after login. Surprisingly though, you'll get up to 35% test coverage out of that one test, which is shocks people. But all of that startup code and all of that authentication and authorization code is actually sort of a big portion of applications. And so you get 25 to 35% test coverage just by having that one hello world one. The second thing we'll do is we'll instrument your application with test coverage, and we will, report that to you. So the third thing we will do is we will block. We're going to block if you have any failing tests, but we're also going to block if the test coverage ever goes down. And this is the key insight. This is the key idea. This is the way to sort of hook them. You did the first part. And the getting started is always the tough part for change, for doing something new. You did the first part with them, but then you gave them a tool that would motivate them along the path of continuing after that first part, because you're going to block anytime the test coverage percentage goes down. So anytime they add new code, the denominator of that test coverage metric is going to increase, which is going to lower the test coverage number, which means that, I have to write tests for that new code that I just wrote, or I can't. Well, how do I write tests? That's big. Well, hey, we had that pairing session. We set up the framework and we've got an example hello world test. Let me just copy that and modify it to test my code that I just wrote this morning. Oh, this is fun. This is easy. Now that I don't have to do all that setup and figure it all out, I can just write a few tests real quick. And wow, my test coverage is now went from 35% to 45% because I wrote a few extra tests here. It starts to level off there, by the way. But over the course of about 6 months of the team gating on a lowering of the test coverage, they get to very high levels of test coverage, 85% or above, typically within about 6 months.
I really like that example because it's showing a fundamental engineering concept. You give me a feedback loop, but it's also using a metric that is influenced by the engineers rather than saying, I'm going to keep a track of how many vulns are coming through, which can be somewhat unpredictable. They can also be very sparse for a long time. So it's easy to say, we haven't had a vuln in a long time, and so we're going to get, we're just going to ignore it. Rather than code coverage, code coverage is going up and down because applications are being built and modified all the time. So I hadn't thought of that before. So I'm basically repeating what you just said because I'm trying to remember it, and I thought it was a great point to make. I'm going to shift real quick, though, because we've been talking about functional testing. Let's talk a little bit more about these security aspects, because with a WAF or with a RASP or IAST, these are tools that do help with those legacy systems. So a lot of what you were talking about, John was talking about, were the applications that are in fact under typically active development, doing those functional testing. Basically, as John kindly reminds me every time I mention refactoring, building the app, because you actually got to earn some money, make a product. But there are those legacy systems that are handling code or basically handling traffic that's likely
customers, right? Money, revenue.
Yeah, revenue, money. So there's, of course, always going to be that overhead bit to worry about, but there's also, how do I deal with those legacy systems? So let's squeeze in a little bit of those recommendations on that harder part that don't have a lot of functional testing, don't even necessarily have ownerships, or somebody gets volunteered to own this legacy system and go fix it somehow?
I mean, I think even for those legacy apps, if at all possible, even if you have to borrow a team for a while, you should eventually go back and upgrade the vulnerability to, patch the vulnerability away a third-party library. Now, if you're 3 major versions behind, like on a framework like Spring, you won't be able to do that without breaking the app. It would require a major engineering effort in most cases, if you fall 2 or 3 major semvers behind the latest. So that's not feasible all the time. But where it is feasible, I think you should eventually go back and do it. What do you do in the meantime to protect yourself? Well, there's WAFs and there's RASP, really, or intrusion protection systems as well. But it's the line between an IPS and a WAF, sort of, I get confused because I'm an AppSec guy, I guess. You got to use something like that. You have to have that be the norm for those applications, especially those applications. I would recommend you do it for all of your applications, even the ones that are actively developed when it's RASP. The problem with WAF is that a lot of folks have it and are spending a lot of money on it and barely using it. And there's good reasons why they're barely using it, because since it's only looking at the input and it's not tracing the whole request all the way through to the possibly dangerous sink like a RASP tool is, it can have false positives, and it's gonna operate on every single request, and so that can be cumbersome, and a lot of folks sort of don't go through the work of testing their WAF use on every app because it's expensive and takes time and a lot of work with an engineering team to do that. A RASP, at least our RASP on the other hand, has 0 false positives. We haven't had one in a long time, and the last one that we did have, it was a bug in the product, and because it has so much more information, it knows the attack got all the way to the spawn command, and so it's going to block that for sure. And so, so I think RASP is sort of the way to go there, but you have to have one or the other, I think, in those cases to give you time to upgrade if you can ever upgrade to that.
Yeah, and there's still some, to instrument the application that does, deploying a tool like that, imagine, it still needs some degree of care and feeding, some degree of just making sure that the instrumentation, we know what the impact is going to be on performance as well. There's not going to be any bugs, software has bugs that do cause us to drop traffic when we didn't want to.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of a WAF, it's going to add some latency, but the CPU cost is sort of on a separate system. It's either in an appliance or a separate computer that's running a reverse proxy or something like that. And so it's not going to consume your AppSec, your application server CPU usage. In the case of a RASP, it actually has to run on the application server. And so you do need to worry a little bit. Our RASP tool for Java only consumes about 3% max. So, but if you have 100 VMs stood up for a particular heavy volume application, and you might need 103 in that case just to handle the throughput. But the bigger problem with RASPs than CPU is memory consumption. So if you're close to the edge of tipping over for memory usage, our RASP can use 10, 15, upwards of 30% for dynamic languages like Ruby and such. We can use a lot of memory when our RASP is running. And so that is something you're going to have to test and engineer around and make sure you're taking into account when you run a RASP.
Awesome. And great things. These are come down to engineering budgets, basically, 100 instances versus 103. You've also pushed us to the edge of our time allotment, Larry. But before we let you go, what does the future look like for you? What's going to be one more thing you're going to add to that list of what you want to be when you grow up?
Well, the last thing I think I said the last time we were on, because it was a DevSecOps conversation, is sort of my side project that Contrast supports me in doing, but it is a side project, is this transformation.dev project. So it's basically a framework for getting teams on this gradual improvement ramp. It's a software that goes with it. So software as a service. We're going to launch that software. It's in alpha right now. We're getting ready to launch the beta here. If you go to transformation.dev, you can sign up for the beta.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll drop that into our Discord. Thank you, Larry. This was a great conversation. Again, we'll have to gradually have you back and transform you into a welcome voice with us.
This is 3 times in a year. I don't know. Maybe I'm overstaying my welcome here. So,
no, we always appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for listening. To learn more about Contrast Security, visit securityweekly.com/contrastsecurity. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.